Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to DANJ's annual fall conference. I'm Beth Patterson, DANJ president. This year we're celebrating 350 years of New Jersey history. We're excited about our speakers and their topics. Before we start our program, I would like to take a minute to recognize a special DANJ member. Linda Oppenheim has served in various capacities on the DANJ Executive Board over the years and has been invaluable as our continuing education chair. The success of our annual conferences has been due in no small part to Linda. This is Linda's last year on the DANJ Executive Board, and we couldn't let her go without acknowledging her service and dedication to DANJ and the documents community. Linda, please accept this as a token of our gratitude and affection. We will miss you. Sorry, kiddo. DANJ is pleased to have Dr. Clement Price as our keynote speaker this year. Dr. Price is the Board of Governors Distinguished Service Professor of History at Rutgers University Newark campus and Director of the Rutgers Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. Dr. Price is the foremost authority on the Black New Jersey experience, New Jersey past, by virtue of his Freedom Not Far From Distant, a documentary history of Afro-Americans in New Jersey, and numerous other scholarly works. He is the recipient of many awards for academic and community service. In 2006, he was inducted into the Rutgers University Hall of Distinguished Alumni. He is also co-founder and co-organizer of the Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series, one of the nation's oldest and prestigious conferences in observance of Black History Month in New Jersey. Welcome, Dr. Price.
Let me thank Ms. Patterson for that very kind introduction, and thank you for your warm reception. I didn't know that Linda Oppenheim was retiring until she told me this morning. So, Linda, enjoy a very active and healthy and transformative retirement. I will join you in 2 years. Well, this is a delight. I should start off by saying I know what you do. I've been a trustee of the Newark Public Library for at least, I'm almost afraid to do the math, about 15 minutes after I moved from East Orange, New Jersey to Newark. I got a call from then Mayor Ken Gibson's office asking me to join the board, and I've been there ever since. And joining that board, well, obviously it took me into the life and times of John Cotton Dana. In fact, I will take some credit for urging the Newark Public Library to embrace John Cotton Dana. Newark Public Library, we're a John Cotton Dana library, and that gets you into places. Not long ago, I had a chance to meet Laura Bush. She and I serve as trustees of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We came in on the same class. And I said, Ms. Bush, I want you to know I consider myself a friend of the American Library Movement, and I'm a trustee of the Newark Public Library, a John Cotton Dana library. And she smiled, and we talked about what that really means at the end of the day. So I'm very honored to be your keynote speaker this morning. And you see my title, New Jersey and the Making of a Public Historian. And what I'd like to do is pretty much wax autobiographically, because I've had a very interesting career as a historian, as a New Jersey resident, as a local historian, as a public historian, and more recently I was appointed Newark City historian by the interim mayor, between Cory Booker and Ras Baraka, a guy by the name of Luis Quintana, asked me to serve as city historian. And Gail, you'll appreciate this. Where are you? The last Newark city historian was Charles Cummings, the great Charles Cummings. And I needed the job like a hole in the head, but to stand on Charles's shoulders is a responsibility that I couldn't pass up. Your proceedings remind me of what I've been saying to my students since, I guess, 2013, that we're living through this long commemorative moment, which librarians, archivists, historians, documentary filmmakers, elected officials have taken advantage of, this long commemorative moment when the nation is reminding itself of some very important turning points. Obviously, the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, sesquicentennial of the war, which has opened up a very broad discussion on how much more we know about that war 150 years later. And when you consider how the nation observed the, say, 100th anniversary of the Civil War, we've come a long way in the last 50 years. So the Civil War, the founding of New Jersey, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's assassination, then fast forward into the 20th century, the March on Washington, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964. In many ways, this is our moment. If we have an interest in any aspect of the past, the next 3 years, maybe more if we go all the way to the 1968 assassination of Dr. King, we should remind our fellow Americans, and indeed the world, how much more we know about the difficult making of the American Republic. I just recently taught a class on Civil War and Reconstruction, followed by a somewhat related class, Emancipation and the Workings of Freedom. And in both classes, what the students seemed to be most fascinated with was how much we know about the brutality of that war. When I was an undergraduate student majoring in history at the University of Bridgeport, I was told by my professors, all good young scholars, that the Civil War took the lives of about 600,000 people. We know that that's a low figure, more like 750,000, which opens up a discussion with so many battered, broken bodies and lives. What was the war all about? So for the first time since I became a professionally trained historian, we locate slavery right in the middle of the war. We locate the slaves right in the middle of the stage of the war. The popularity of the film, the Spielberg film, Lincoln, has opened up a discussion. Did Lincoln become an abolitionist all by himself? And the answer is no. He had some help from the slaves who forced his hand, and he had this remarkable relationship over 3 or 4 years with Frederick Douglass. And the film, great film, but it doesn't complicate Lincoln's transformation over the course of the war. So what I'd like to do is to take you a bit through my evolution as a public historian and what New Jersey had to do with that. Generationally, I am a third generation, maybe a fourth, depending on how you look at the calendar, generation of students who have benefited from and contributed to what used to be called the Negro History Movement. And I'm amazed at how many Americans, even Americans in the history business, so to speak, don't know how indebted we are to that movement. In many ways, that movement set the stage for the kind of history that we mostly know, the so-called new social history or the new American history. A lot of that is indebted to the Negro history movement from the late 19th century probably to the 1930s. And I always am reminded of the founding father of that movement, a guy by the name of George Washington Williams, not a professionally trained historian. He was a journalist. He fought on the Union side of the Civil War. He dabbled in politics. And toward the later years of his life, he wrote and ultimately published a massive 2-volume work entitled The Negro Race in America. It came out in 1884. Some years ago, the great historian John Hope Franklin wrote a biography about George Washington Williams and subsequently argued that he thought George Washington Williams was perhaps the most important historian in American historical studies. You know, some would argue George Bancroft, some might argue Schlesinger. You pick your luminary, but George Washington Williams has to be in your top 3 or 5 because of that book. And this is 1884, and for those of you, when it came out, for those of you who remember your American and African American history, that was a tough part of the 19th century. Reconstruction had ended. The benefits of freedom were brought into question. Thousands of blacks were being ushered to the bottom of American society. The right to suffrage for black men was increasingly denied them. And this is when George Washington Williams decides to write a book. This is what he said in the preface of that book. I have tracked my bleeding countrymen through the widely scattered documents of American history. Great first line. I have listened to their groans, their clanking chains, and melting prayers, until the woes of a race and the agonies of centuries seem to crowd upon my soul as a bitter reality. He continues, many pages of this history have been blistered with my tears. And although having lived but a little more than a generation, my mind feels as if it were cycles old. End of quote. Such a passage probably would not be written by a professionally trained historian. I was taught, remain objective, stay above the fray, and don't let your emotions get in the way of accuracy and diligence. Some years ago, though, when I was doing some work, I believe at the New Jersey Historical Society, I came across a document, a newspaper advertisement for a slave ship coming into Cooper's Ferry, which back in the day it was called Cooper's Ferry, now it's Camden. And the slave ship was coming into Camden directly from the river Gambia. Now, I had recently read Alex Haley's great book, Roots, and I must say, not unlike George Washington Williams, I was emotionally taken with that document. And even though I've been writing history, teaching history for well over 40 years, sometimes a document will catch you by surprise, leave you fighting back your emotions. In the years that were to follow George Washington Williams' book, and in the face of considerable indifference from the history community, Negro history etched its way into the larger story of the American Republic, to such an extent that when you take African Americans out of that story, the story doesn't make any sense. Whether you're talking about the American Revolution, the Civil War, the urbanization of the United States in the 20th century, the rockiness of the decade of the 1960s, race, blackness, and whiteness are all in together. In fact, maybe some of you might be interested, I have struck up a friendship with two white guys from the South, good men. One you probably know because he's the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Martin Luther King, Taylor Branch. Taylor Branch was born in white segregated Atlanta, Georgia, at a time when Dr. King was a kid. And Taylor Branch, as most of you know, is the quintessential biographer of King, 3 volumes. He and I sit on the scholarly advisory committee for the African American Museum that's going up on the mall. The other white guy is lesser known but no less distinguished. His name is Gus Speth, who was born in white segregated Orangeburg, South Carolina, and he was a kid when the so-called Orangeburg Massacre took place. Lesser known than Kent State, because that involved, the Orangeburg Massacre involved a South Carolina state trooper who happened to be white, shot and killed a black student at South Carolina State. And Gus Speth and his family witnessed all of that. So Gus Speth just retired from the University of Vermont Law School, which is one of the foremost law schools in the nation dealing with environmental issues and environmental justice. So knowing Gus and knowing Taylor, I've invited them to come to Newark, where else, to the Newark Museum, and we 3 sons of the South, by the way, I'm from Washington, D.C., surely a southern city. I didn't know that until I grew up, but it is. So we 3 sons of the South, and that's the title of the program, are going to have a conversation about the South, about race, whiteness, blackness, memory, and I'm especially interested in talking with Gus and Taylor about how, as white men of the South, they managed to navigate themselves to the kind of guys they've become, these great contributors to American democracy, social justice, environmental justice, and in Taylor Branch's sense, in the sense of Taylor Branch, his wonderful narrative on Dr. King. So the point is here that Negro history has found its way to America, the larger story of the American Republic, and that's a good thing. The indifference against Negro history was profound. Many of the leading founding fathers of the Negro history movement could not get jobs at predominantly white schools, okay? First and second generation. The guy who maybe made a breakthrough, the only guy, was probably John Hope Franklin when he taught at Brooklyn College. Then he went to the University of Chicago and finally retired from Duke University. But he was the first, and John Hope Franklin is coming through the profession in the 1940s. That's kind of like within my lifetime. Let me just give you the names of some of these founding fathers. George Washington Williams, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, James Brawley, R.R. Wright, Luther Porter Jackson, one woman, Marion Thompson Wright, from New Jersey, born in East Orange, raised in Newark, Howard University, Columbia University for her PhD, where she studied under the great cultural intellectual historian Merrill Curti. And she finishes her PhD at Columbia Teachers College in 1941, and then teaches for many years at Howard University. Benjamin Quarles and John Hope Franklin. Those men and Marion and others insisted that the Negro's story in American history was essential to understanding the old story. And in retrospect, they were right, and in real time, we are indebted to them. By the post-World War II years, when the history profession opened up to a more diverse constellation of scholars, research agendas, in archival resources, the history of the nation went through a powerful transformation. And I think you all know that. I certainly realized that when I was in undergraduate school at Bridgeport in the mid to late 1960s. Over the course of my professional life then, I have borne witness to revolutionary changes in archival development, and those changes at once hastened and followed the so-called New American History. How did that New American History influence my own evolution? Well, first of all, it was more intellectually and morally challenging. Not only with respect to African American history, but also the women's history, Native American history, the history of workers, the penchant for violence in 19th century American history. I'll never forget reading John Hope Franklin's, perhaps his best book, is a book about the militant South. That was the title, The Militant South. He wanted to know why the South was so violent, not only against blacks, we would expect that, but white violence against whites was in the extreme, according to John Hope Franklin. So that New American History that I interrogated, read, and as an undergraduate and graduate student wrote, influenced me as a young man, a young citizen. I came to New Jersey the year after the 1967 riots in Newark. But let's be careful. Those of you who know something about Newark know that in some quarters in that city, if you use the word riot, you're in trouble. Some people call it a riot. Others call it a revolution. In fact, there's a award-winning documentary film entitled Revolution 67 by two Italian-American filmmakers out of Newark. They're Buongiornos. The film won the OAH top prize in documentary filmmaking when it came out in 2007. But anyway, I come to Newark the year after the riot, the rebellion, the insurrection. The New Jersey State Troopers called it anarchy. Many Jewish residents called it a pogrom because of the disproportionately large number of Jewish businesses that were burned and looted. That's when I came to Newark. And the city at the time was very sad, very broken, almost as if it was spiritually spent. But in retrospect, it was a fortuitous time for me to arrive in Newark because the city, for all sorts of reasons, had very little clue, historical clue, as to why something like that could happen in a city like Newark. If you read Philip Roth, which I have read, you would never get the impression that the city that Philip Roth grew up in would have such a calamity as it had in 1967. So I immediately, upon arrival, became interested in what happened in Newark to bring about the calamity of 1967. So the point here is that an American historian, such as me, interested in race, African American history, and American urban history, could not find a better place to land than Newark, New Jersey. There had been very little research on Newark prior to '67. Some of the research that I relied on had been written 2 generations earlier. There had been very little on the history of Newark's large Jewish community, its even larger Italian community. Marion, in her dissertation, looked at Negro history in New Jersey, but mainly through the lens of education. That was her dissertation, was a history of Negro education in New Jersey. So I saw an opportunity to complicate Newark's past by looking at how race worked in the city, how the great migration of the 20th century affected Newark, how Newark received blacks vis-a-vis its reception of, say, Russian Jewish immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so I committed myself to a dissertation on the making of a Negro community in Newark from the early decades of the last century to the ratification of New Jersey's 1947 state constitution. That's what I was interested in, 1917 to 1947. I completed that work in 1975. By the time I finished up, I had taken journey after journey into governmental documents, public documents that reveal the depth of New Jersey's seemingly Southern-like character with respect to race relations, especially race relations that turn toward the white-black confrontation. In fact, there's a great book that came out in the early 1960s by E. Frederick Morrow. It's long out of print, but you can probably get it. It's essential reading if you want to know why New Jersey still grapples with race. It was entitled, or is entitled, Way Up North, Down South by E. Frederick Morrow. He was from Bergen County, New Jersey, educated, well-educated. He was a veteran, and he became the first Negro, the first African American to serve as special assistant to the president, and that president was Dwight Eisenhower. Okay? He ultimately became a big official with the Urban League, the National Urban League. So the documents that I explored, public and private, revealed that New Jersey, although a northern state, behaved very much like a southern state. It revealed an unmistakable tradition of racial exclusion in its 1844 state constitution. There was something rather interesting, too, in the goodly number of black towns that black people founded in southern New Jersey and some exclusively black communities in northern New Jersey, most notably the Vauxhall section of Union, New Jersey. And I was taken aback by that. In fact, many of the migrants who came to New Jersey between World Wars I and II referred to New Jersey as the Georgia of the North. That was a very popular perception of New Jersey in the black community. So I worked on the dissertation. I finished it. I published some chapters from it. And then I turned my attention to a larger study, a documentary history of Afro-Americans in New Jersey, which came out in the early 80s, Freedom Not Far Distant, a documentary history of Afro-Americans in New Jersey. And I think it's fair to say that that is, up until recently, the most significant publication of mine, because I brought into the public sphere or public understanding a lot of documents that had been sequestered, never really explored by scholars, never resonating in the black community or the New Jersey press or the white community. And that history was made possible by archivists and librarians with whom I forged the kind of relationships that historians need to forge to get their work done. I'll never forget when I went into what used to be called the New Jersey Reference Room, or the New Jersey Room of the Newark Public Library, and I've said this story before. Charles Cummings treated me as, and I'm a graduate student, he treated me as if I were John Hope Franklin. And that really mattered to me. I'm hardly John Hope Franklin, but Charles would anticipate things I needed to see in public and private sources. The Newark Public Library then and now just is an abundance of primary sources useful to graduate students and full-fledged scholars. I might just add that Freedom Not Far Distant was a collaboration, a public-private collaboration between the New Jersey Historical Commission, which was so much more resourced then as opposed to now. I mean, the Historical Commission, when I was in graduate school, was publishing books, multiple conferences, giving grants to whippersnappers like me. My first grant was from the New Jersey Historical Commission, and the commission collaborated resource-wise with the New Jersey Historical Society to publish Freedom Not Far Distant, something unheard of in the second decade of the 21st century. Freedom Not Far Distant, in retrospect, was in many ways a prototype for the use of public and private documents to tell the story of race, African American history, and how New Jersey history is situated in the larger history of the nation. When I pulled that book together, I really wanted to locate the story of Black New Jersey in this larger story. In other words, yes, New Jersey had slavery. How is it similar and different than Southern slavery? Yes, New Jersey produced a remarkable number of Black luminaries in every sector: scholarship, the arts, invention, education. I mean, it's a wealthy state in terms of the kind of people who've been born here. I mean, just last week at the DANJ Poetry Festival, the largest poetry festival in North America, and for the last, 6 years, it has convened where? In Newark, New Jersey. And one of the last events of the Poetry Festival on Sunday was a tribute reading of Amiri Baraka's poems. Billy Collins, Rita Dove, a wonderful Native American poet by the name of Diaz, I'm just forgetting her first name. And I sat there at NJPAC's Prudential Hall, beautiful, beautiful venue. If you haven't seen it, you need to make your way to Newark. And it just struck me how New Jersey once had this great issue where we kind of dethroned Amiri Baraka as poet laureate. That now is still a painful memory to some, but Baraka, for all sorts of reasons, has been brought back into the constellation of New Jersey artists who matter to us. And he is, of course, not the only person. So the mentors who helped to open my imagination and encouraged me to respect all sorts of documents, especially documents that came out of the public sphere, should be mentioned here. And we've lost so many of these people. The late Don Sinclair, who held forth at Alexander Library when I was a graduate student. I mean, he pulled together a essentially an index, an inventory of all, not all, it can never account for all, but many primary source material related to the history of African Americans in New Jersey. That was absolutely essential to get me started on my dissertation and ultimately Freedom Not Far Distant. Richard L. McCormick. I mean, when I was in graduate school at Rutgers, many of the students in the PhD program were doing New Jersey history. The late Paul Stellhorn, Spencer Crew, Herb Foster, Margaret Marsh We were all doing New Jersey history because the most influential historian at Rutgers University, all campuses, was Dick McCormick. And he did New Jersey history and also did national political history. He was a major, major force at the time being the 1970s and 80s, on the kind of work that was being done by students at Rutgers. The number of students at Rutgers who are doing New Jersey history has really, really plummeted. There may not be a student on the New Brunswick campus doing New Jersey history. On the Newark campus, a lot of my students are doing Newark history, but they're doing it in American studies. One of my students is, as you know, is doing a dissertation on how Newark remembers itself over the course of the 20th century. Another student, John Johnson, just defended a wonderful dissertation on the transformation of the Great Weequahic section in Newark from an idyllic Jewish community to a somewhat problematic black community. Why such a transformation? A lot of it had to do with public policy that coincided with the out-migration of a Jewish population. But I should mention some of the other people who influenced me. Don Skimmer, who's here at Princeton now. He used to be at the New Jersey Historical Society. John Cunningham, the late John Cunningham, and of course, Charles Cummings. They all were wonderfully attentive to the importance of documents, the preservation of documents, and the accessibility of documents to the general public. I learned over the course of many years that Charles Cummings treated everybody as if they were John Hope Franklin, not just me. He was just consistently helpful, kind, encouraging. With such individuals as mentors and advocates for the kind of history I wanted to pursue, it was no surprise that I quickly became a public historian, and I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes. Public history is risky, or at least it used to be risky, especially if you wanted to get tenure. There was this perception when I was at Rutgers, Newark campus, that my involvement in the Newark community meant that I was not a serious scholar. I might just add, some of my more senior colleagues thought I was not a senior scholar when I won the Outstanding Teacher of the Year award. You can't be a serious scholar, Clem, if you're a great teacher. It doesn't go. It's true story. In fact, when I not to brag, but I won 3 Outstanding Teacher awards at the university, the campus, and then the larger university. The chair of my department, Elliot Rosen, the great Elliot Rosen, he said, "Clem, congratulations. You just won the kiss of death." What a thing to say to someone not quite tenured. But I stayed involved in the public sphere because of people like Charles, because of Dick McCormick, John Cunningham. And then when I got involved in Marion's life and time, she too was involved in the public sphere as a young scholar. She was a social worker in Newark during the 1930s. So I committed myself to the public sphere, to public service, and to public intellectual work. And I never really looked back. And it paid off in the sense that by the time I came up for tenure, I had sufficient publications and a sufficient kind of public notoriety that my tenured professors could not dismiss that as unimportant. In fact, in my tenure packet, you probably know this, you have to get letters from scholars and other people who know your work. Well, one of the letters in my packet when I came up for promotion to associate professor with tenure was from Tom Kane. who just happened to be governor. Can you imagine? You're paging through these boring letters and you see a letter from the governor. Why would Tom Kean write a letter on my behalf? Well, when I was coming up for tenure, I was also chair of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. Around the time that Kean was governor, and those of you who follow Tom Kean, you know he put a lot of money into the Arts Council to strengthen the New Jersey, he loves opera, to strengthen the New Jersey State Opera, to make sure the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra would play on tune or in tune. He had this vision of New Jersey being a haven for creative people. And I was chair. And because I was a historian, I was able to historically contextualize for my colleagues on the council what American art and culture really looked like. Most of these people, good people, they were from the suburbs. They were disproportionately Republican, no problem there. But their vision of the arts was highbrow art. Only highbrow art should receive state funding. So the symphony should get funding, but not the Crossroads Theater. The opera should get funding, but not WBGO 88.3 on your FM dial. So in one of the conversations we had at the Arts Council table, I had to gently walk my colleagues through the history of jazz. That it's a music that comes from the bottom of our society. It cross-fertilizes with European music. Hip white guys get into it in the 1930s. And the rest is the globalization of an American art form. So now WBGO, which is located right next door to the New Jersey Historical Society, is the most listened to jazz station in the world because of the internet. So Kean, in his letter in support of my tenure, kind of recited all of this, that Clem Price is a public historian who has the ability to reach beyond the academy and help make sense out of the complicated history of American culture. One final Kean story, you guys probably know he was very much behind the construction of the New Jersey Performing Arts Center in Newark. At the time, some people thought the governor had lost his mind. At that time, you don't build anything in Newark. People are leaving Newark. Newark is a nearly failed city. So Tom Kean smartly brought on a consulting firm, I forget their name, but they said the best place to build the last major performing arts center in the United States was Newark, New Jersey. Why? The infrastructure is there. You can get to Newark from anywhere. Plus, Newark already had an arts infrastructure, a major art museum, the Newark Museum, a library system, John Cotton Dana's Newark Public Library System. 5 institutions of higher learning, UMDNJ, Rutgers, 2 law schools, and a county college. So Newark was selected. And at the time, I was winding down as chair of the Arts Council, but I was winding up essentially a road speech on why New Jersey needed to invest in Newark and needed to deepen its investment in all of its old river towns, Paterson, Newark, Camden, Trenton, New Brunswick. All of these great old towns had been hobbled by suburbanization, the excessive dependency on old racial notions, what race meant in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So Newark was chosen, and I think you probably know the rest is a good story. The Newark in the second decade of the 21st century is quite different than Newark in 1960 or 1970 or 1980. It's not just because of NJPAC, but NJPAC served as an accelerator for the recovery of that old town. Okay. The town that I wanted to be most useful in, taking nothing away from my interest in places like Princeton and Trenton and suburban New Jersey, was Newark. I thought that Newark was not only the state's largest city, but its most important. And I've committed much of my time in New Jersey to Newark. And I've tried to forge an intersection between my interest in being a public historian and the emergence of the new American history. And let me just mention a few things. The Marion Thompson Wright Lecture Series. Giles Wright, the late Giles Wright, who used to be at the New Jersey Historical Commission. He died about 5 years ago. Giles and I thought that Black History Month had lost its interest in history, and we wanted to mount at Rutgers in Newark a Black History Month series named after Marion Thompson Wright. That series will be 35 years old next February. If you've never been there, do yourself a favor, because although it's a Black History Month program, about a third of the audience, maybe more, are not Black Americans. Many white Americans, many Hispanic Americans know that African American history might be the most appropriate lens through which to interrogate the relationship between democracy and race. That's number one. Number two, the transformation of what used to be the Negro history movement into the new American history has been rather fascinating, given the number of white scholars who, at the end of the day, beginning and end of the day, are African American historians. Eric Foner, the late Lawrence Levine, Stephen Hahn. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And many of these men and women who explore African American history, the new African American history, never get a chance to speak to a predominantly white audience, a predominantly Black audience, in real time in a city like New Jersey. And when they come to Newark, and by the way, the conference unfolds at the Paul Robeson Campus Center on Martin Luther King Boulevard. You know, you gotta love this country being able to pull off something like that in historical time. In 2007, I pulled together some fellow historians, some people from the Newark Public Library, some individuals from Mayor Booker's office, some reporters from the Star-Ledger. And for 6 months in 2007, Newark commemorated what happened in 1967. There were about 125 riots that summer, the most infamous being Detroit. Detroit is still not recovered from its 1967 riot. And maybe Newark has not recovered, but at least Newark is interrogating what happened 40 years ago, now getting close to 50 years ago. The scholarship is clearly there that the city was declining in the 1960s. A lot of Newarkers, when I came to Newark, they thought Newark was a great town up until the summer of 1967. Historians know that things like riots or other upheavals or breakdown in law and order usually have a history, okay? So we have brought Kenneth Jackson to Newark to explain Newark's decline in ways that are persuasive and true. I managed to get a meeting with the editorial board of the Star-Ledger, because the Star-Ledger and the Newark Evening News closed in the early 70s, never got the riot right. They bought into the New York Times view of the riot as something that it was not. There were snipers on the tops of high-rise public housing projects. The cops did no wrong. The state troopers were trying to restore law and order. It's not that that is untrue, but it's partially true. So over the course of 2007, we had public program after public program. We created a bibliography. The Buongiornos came out with their film. The New Jersey Historical Society mounted an exhibit, an oral history-driven exhibit on the summer of 1967. And the Star-Ledger, through a young, talented reporter, a guy by the name of Brad Parks, who took the buyout, he wrote a 5 or 6 issues on 67. What led up to it? What went wrong? How is it remembered? Why is Newark, New Jersey still recovering from what happened 40 years ago? And it was a remarkable season of commemoration, interrogation, inter-ethnic, interracial fellowship. In fact, the first program we had at Ahavas Shalom, the last Jewish congregation in Newark. Why? Because that riot, that disturbance, that rebellion, that revolution really hit the Jewish community hard, hastening an accelerated exodus from the city of their birth. Okay? And knowing something about memory, when people move out of their old shul, their old neighborhood, where they were bar mitzvahed, they may move out, but their memories remain invested into those places. One of my best stories about Newark in recent times, one of the great temples in Newark, B'nai Jeshurun, moved out around 1965, 66, somewhere in there. And they recently celebrated their 160th anniversary. They're now located in upscale Short Hills. When their 160th anniversary was nigh, they celebrated in Newark at their old synagogue. It was just an extraordinary experience. Buses and buses of Jewish parishioners coming back to their old temple to observe the power of place and memory. We are building an oral history archive in Newark, the Kruger Scott Archive, which is a compilation of interviews taken some years ago when Giles Wright and I essentially taught a group of elderly black people how to conduct oral history interviews. Those interviews were taken on tape, stored at the Newark Public Library, and forgotten for many, many years until one of my graduate students, Samantha Boardman, literally stumbled across them. And now we're trying to digitize those interviews and put them on the web for everyone to see. And finally, in 2016, I will hopefully be a contributing person to the celebration of Newark's 350th anniversary. That's old by American standards. How should a city so old and complicated, a city that has had issues with race and ethnicity and poverty and public health, do you celebrate the 350th? Well, yeah, you almost have to. But what we hope to do is to commemorate and interrogate why Newark's history is so complicated and why the city has had so many episodes of so many episodes when it's the better angels of its nature are so difficult to summon. In closing, let me mention the most recent documentary collection I've been involved in. Some of you know in the 1930s, over 2,000 elderly black people in their 80s, 90s, and north of that were interviewed about slavery. It's called the WPA Slave Narratives. So last year, Greenwood Press asked Lonnie Bunch, the inaugural director of the African American Museum the Smithsonian will open on the Mall in 2016, Spencer Crew, who I went to graduate school with, and me, to pull these narratives together in a new publication. And it came out last year. It's entitled Slave Culture, a documentary collection of the slave narratives from the Federal Writers Project, 1936 to 1938. Most historians of my generation knew something about the narratives. They've been around a while. In fact, when historians started using them, the historiography of slavery changed, because for the first time, the story was to some extent examined through the memories of people who survived slavery. But I'd never read every narrative as I have now. And in doing so, and by the way, the narratives were ultimately housed at the Library of Congress, and they're still there. In going through narrative after narrative, Spencer, Lonnie, and I decided we would look at those narratives through the lens of the new history and the lens of the new history of slavery, where women become very, very important, where growing up a child in slavery is very important, or how slaves contended with the Civil War, or how slaves contended with nutrition or the lack thereof, or how women slaves contended with sexual battery from white and black men. Fascinating. So I've almost come full circle in my career, where I started off working with public and private documents, and toward the latter years of my career, I'm back working with documents. And they speak to me, and they influence my thinking. The very last thing that has kind of enriched my life as a historian has to do with, and now I forget which button to advance the, oh, here we go. A couple of years ago, President Obama, no, I don't know him, but people think I do, and I forget to tell him I don't. He appointed me vice chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The good news is that historic preservation, which I always thought was something that valorized, you know, essentially what was left by the upper class, what was left by white Americans, what people of means value. That's in many ways the old historic preservation movement. So the historic preservation movement that I now am a part of has been or is being informed by the new American history. And this is an example. This is Fort Monroe, Virginia, where there's been a lot of attention on Fort Monroe, Virginia, and what happened here. I'll keep it short. 4 black guys learning of the beginning of the Civil War decide to make a break for freedom. They find them, they manage to get to Fort Monroe, where the commandant there, Benjamin Butler, designates them essentially slaves, but they would be contraband. The more recent scholarship on slavery and freedom claim that that's the beginning, this is the beginning of the Great Migration, that the slaves are freeing themselves. They're not waiting on Lincoln. They're not waiting on the Union Army. They are pragmatic and opportunistic. And when you sense that, or you read that, it's like a paradigm shift. Indeed, in 2013, Stephen Hahn, a very distinguished scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, said this: the Civil War began as a revolution of slaveholders. It ended as a revolution of slaves. And when he said that, he was one of the right lecturers, there was this gasp. We had about 1,000 people that Saturday, because you never think of the Civil War in such a term, which might be hard for many of us to wrap our heads around, but I got it immediately because the new scholarship on slavery and the slave narratives that I've been reading, the slaves did make breaks for freedom. Hundreds of them, ultimately thousands of them. So that's Fort Monroe, which is now a historic site and was declared a historic site last year by President Obama. You remember Eyes on the Prize, that very scary episode, Bridge to Freedom, which dealt with the Selma March. Well, the march crossed that bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is now a very important historic site in the United States where people will make pilgrimages and walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In fact, the South, taking nothing away from our 350th anniversary, the South is now marketing its civil rights movement battlegrounds. This being one, given what happened here when when Alabama state troopers and sheriff deputies confronted civil rights marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beat them back across the bridge. You've probably all seen that footage. This is the museum that's being built as we meet this morning, the National African American Museum of History and Culture. It will be the last museum to open on. There's no more space on them all right? Now, I saw this in real time, and I kind of flinched when I saw it. This is Nat Turner's Bible, one of the artifacts that the museum has. What was Nat Turner reading, one might ask? This is another artifact. This is Harriet Tubman. She looks like she's 1,000,000 years old. This was taken around 1902, and she is wrapped up in a shawl given to her by Queen Victoria. And the museum has the shawl, and it will be exhibited. Pardon the personal indulgence. I wrote an article back in the spring of this year about my grandmother's house and how powerful it was when I was a kid. She lived at 1010 Oak Street in a historically segregated black community, and my parents insisted that my brother, sister, and I have some knowledge about the South because both of my parents were Southern born. And this is a picture in the article. I'm the little tart on the far right next to a friend of the family, Alberta Jackson. My grandmother, Lillian Spann, Big Mama to me, is the rather large woman in the center. Alberta's son, brother Doug, is standing next to my grandmother, And on the grass is my mother, the late Anna Christine Spann Price, and my brother James. And what has happened as I've gotten older in the profession, and as I'm connecting documents and photographs and memories, I'm like a 24/7 historian who is now weaving into what I write in my scholarship, my own upbringing, why I am who I think I am. And that's something I probably would never have done 20 years ago. The Colored YMCA here in Princeton, there's a national movement involving recovering the memories of these YM and YWCAs because they were segregated up until the Civil Rights Movement. And they tended to be very important community centers in black communities. Southern Slave House, historic black community in Queens. The Lyric Theater in Lexington, Kentucky. And I'll end with that. And I've gone too far, and I apologize. So in summary, I thank you for what you've been doing professionally. I've relied on what you do so well, and I've been blessed by knowing the kinds of people who collect documents, valorize documents, and make them accessible to the general public. Thank you very much.